The sound of crying was the first thing Adrian Cole heard. Not loud, not dramatic. Soft, broken, almost swallowed by the cold wind moving through the cemetery. It was a kind of crying that came from deep pain, the kind that made a person stop without even knowing why. Adrian froze mid-step, his breath turning faintly white in the morning air, his eyes searching the rows of graves ahead of him. He had not come here in years, not since the day they buried his son. For a long moment, Adrian stood beside his black car at the edge of the cemetery, staring at the familiar hill as if it were a place from another lifetime. The driver had offered to walk with him, but Adrian waved him off. This was something he had to face alone. The wind tugged at his coat as he began walking. Slow steps over the gravel path, past rows of silent names carved into stone. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the ground itself was trying to hold him back. Daniel Cole, his son, 12 years old, gone in a hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and quiet despair. Adrian had buried himself in work afterward, in meetings, in numbers, in towers of glass and steel that reached into the sky. It was easier to build empires than to sit with grief, easier to chase profit than to face the empty chair at the dinner table. But that morning, something had pulled him here, a strange restlessness, a weight in his chest he couldn't ignore. And now, as he walked closer to Daniel's grave, he saw them, two small figures kneeling in the grass, twin boys, no older than 8 or 9, both wearing thin jackets that looked too light for the cold, both crying quietly, their heads bowed, their shoulders trembling in silence. Dark curls stirred in the wind. Their hands rested gently on the marble headstone, as if they were afraid to let go. Adrian stopped several steps away, his brow tightening in confusion. No one visited this grave. Not anymore. The relatives had stopped coming years ago. Even Adrian himself had stayed away, unable to bear the memories that lived in this place. So who were these boys? He stepped closer, the gravel crunching under his polished shoes. The sound seemed loud in the stillness, but the boys didn't react at first. They were lost in their grief, in their quiet whispering. "I wish he could have met us," one of them said, his voice small, trembling. The words hit Adrian like a sudden chill. Met us? A strange unease crept into his chest. He felt it tightening, spreading, like a shadow moving through his thoughts. He took another step forward, close enough now to see the tears on the boys' cheeks, the redness in their eyes, the way their fingers clutched the edge of the headstone, as if it were the only thing holding them steady. "Why are you here?" Adrian asked. His voice came out sharper than he intended, edged with the authority he carried everywhere, the tone that made boardrooms fall silent. But beneath it, there was something else, something unsteady, something almost fragile. The boys turned. For a moment, no one spoke. The wind moved softly through the trees, carrying the faint rustle of leaves and the distant sound of a passing car somewhere beyond the cemetery gates. Adrian felt his breath catch. There was something in their faces, something familiar, not obvious, not something he could name, but enough to make his heart beat a little faster. Their eyes held a quiet strength, a calmness beneath the sadness, and for reasons he couldn't explain, Adrian felt a flicker of fear rise inside him. The taller twin wiped his cheeks with the sleeve of his jacket. "We didn't mean to disturb anything, sir," he said quietly. "Sir." The words sounded strange here, in a place where titles and wealth meant nothing, where every stone marked a life reduced to a name and 2 dates. "This is my son's grave," Adrian said, his voice lower now. The boys exchanged a glance. Not surprised, not embarrassed, just silent, as if they had expected this moment all along. "We know," the other twin said softly. Adrian frowned. "You know?" Neither boy answered immediately. They looked down at the grave again, and the silence stretched, thick and heavy. Adrian felt irritation stirring, the familiar impatience of a man used to quick answers and clear explanations. But beneath it, there was something else growing. Curiosity mixed with strange, uneasy tension. The taller boy reached out and brushed a small leaf off the marble surface, his movements gentle, almost protective. "He was kind," he said quietly. Adrian blinked. The word struck him harder than he expected. Kind. It was not the word people usually use when they spoke about a son. They spoke of illness, of tragedy, of loss. But kindness, that was something deeper, something personal. How do you know that? Adrian asked. The boys hesitated again. Their eyes met briefly, as if sharing a silent decision. Then they looked back at Adrian, and for the first time, he saw something in their expressions that unsettled him even more than their tears. Recognition. Not the kind strangers feel when they recognize a famous face. Something deeper. Something that suggested they knew more about him than they should. Adrian felt a faint chill run down his spine. He wasn't a man easily shaken. He had negotiated billion-dollar deals without blinking, faced hostile takeovers, crushed competitors who underestimated him. Fear was not something he experienced often, but standing there in the cold wind, under the gray sky, looking into the eyes of two crying boys who seemed to carry a secret he couldn't yet see, Adrian felt it, a quiet, creeping fear. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice quieter now. The boys didn't answer right away. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the grass around the grave, carrying the distant sound of church bells somewhere far away. Time seemed to slow, the world narrowing to the three of them standing there in the silence. Finally, the taller twin spoke. "My name is Isaiah," he said. Then he nodded toward his brother. "And this is Isaac." Adrian waited. The names meant nothing to him. But the way the boys stood there, the way they looked at the grave, the way their eyes held that quiet, steady sadness, it all felt like the beginning of something he wasn't ready to understand. "And why?" Adrian said slowly. "Are you crying for my son?" Isaiah looked down at the grave again, his lips trembling slightly. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Because," he said, "he was part of our family." The words hung in the cold air like a crack of thunder that hadn't yet reached the ears. Adrian felt the ground shift beneath him. Not literally, but in the way a person feels when their world tilts, when something impossible begins to form at the edges of understanding. Part of their family? It made no sense. None at all. And yet, as Adrian looked at the two boys standing before him, at the tears still shining in their eyes, at the quiet certainty in their voices, he felt a strange, undeniable truth pressing in from all sides. Whatever these boys were about to reveal, it was going to change everything. The wind moved slowly through the cemetery, bending the tall grass and carrying a quiet, hollow sound that seemed to echo the silence between them. Adrian Cole stood still, staring at the two boys, his mind struggling to catch up with the words he had just heard. "Our mother worked for your family." The sentence lingered in the air, heavy and unfinished, like a door only half opened. The boys glanced at each other again, as if deciding how much to say, as if speaking these memories out loud carried weight. Finally, the older twin straightened his shoulders, trying to look braver than he felt. "She was a nurse," he said softly. "She took care of Daniel when he was sick." For a moment, Adrian said nothing. His eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in concentration. He searched his memory, flipping through years of faces, voices, uniforms, and brief introductions that had meant little to him at the time. Nurses had come and gone. Specialists, assistants, night staff. To Adrian, they had been part of the background of the hospital room, like machines humming quietly in the dark. But then, faintly, a memory surfaced. A young black woman sitting beside Daniel's bed long after visiting hours had ended, a calm voice reading softly from a book, a gentle hand adjusting a blanket. Adrian remembered walking in once, late at night, and seeing Daniel smiling, really smiling, for the first time in weeks. And the nurse had been sitting beside him, patient, kind, as if time did not matter to her at all. Adrian blinked, returning to the present. "What does that have to do with this?" he asked, his tone sharper now, defensive without fully understanding why. The younger twin looked up, and there was something in his eyes that stopped Adrian cold. It wasn't fear. It wasn't sadness. It was anger, quiet, controlled, but real. Everything. The boy said. The word landed heavily. The brothers exchanged another glance, and then, slowly, they began to speak. Their voices were steady, but the pain beneath their words was clear, like a wound that had never healed. They told him how their mother had worked long nights at the hospital, often staying past her shift to sit with Daniel when he couldn't sleep. She never talked about it as work. They said, She used to tell them that some people needed kindness more than medicine, and that Daniel was one of those people. Adrian felt a strange discomfort growing in his chest. He shifted his weight slightly, his hands tightening inside his coat pockets. She cared about him, Isaiah said quietly, not because she was paid to, because she wanted to. The wind stirred again, colder now, brushing against Adrian's face. And when Daniel died, Isaac continued, everything changed. Adrian frowned. What do you mean? The boys hesitated, as if the next part was harder to say. She lost her job, Isaiah said. A week later, Adrian's brows drew together. That doesn't make sense. But even as he said it, a faint, uneasy feeling crept into his thoughts. He knew how corporations worked. He knew how quickly departments were reorganized, how quietly contracts were ended, how easily people disappeared from payroll sheets once they were no longer needed. Decisions like that rarely reached his desk. She said they told her services were no longer required. Isaac said, his voice tight, no severance, no help, nothing. The word struck Adrian harder than he expected. He felt something shift inside him, something uncomfortable and unfamiliar. The boys continued, their voices low but steady. They spoke about small apartments and late nights, about their mother working 2 jobs, sometimes 3, coming home exhausted but still smiling, still cooking, still asking about their schoolwork as if her own pain didn't matter. She never complained. Isaiah said, not once. Adrian swallowed slowly. The cemetery felt quieter now, the silence pressing in from all sides. She used to talk about Daniel, Isaac added. She said he was brave, that he never gave up, even when he was scared. Adrian felt his throat tighten. She said he was kind. Isaiah said softly, kinder than most adults she knew. For a moment, Adrian couldn't speak. The image of his son, pale and thin in that hospital bed, rose in his mind with painful clarity. He remembered the way Daniel used to look at people, not with judgment or pride, but with simple curiosity, with warmth. Daniel had never cared about wealth or status. Those things had meant nothing to him. The wind rustled through the trees, and Adrian became aware of a dull ache forming in his chest, something deeper than grief, something closer to guilt. And then, Isaac said quietly, he stopped, his voice faltering. And then what? Adrian asked, his voice softer now. Our mother got sick, Isaiah said. The words were simple, but they carried a weight that seemed to settle over the entire cemetery. She kept working, Isaac continued. She said she didn't have a choice. We needed food. We needed rent. So she kept going even when she could barely stand. Adrian felt his jaw tighten. She died 3 months ago, Isaiah said. The silence that followed was heavier than anything that had come before. Even the wind seemed to pause, as if the world itself was holding its breath. I'm sorry, Adrian said quietly. The words felt small, inadequate, almost meaningless in the face of what the boys had endured. Isaiah nodded slightly, but Isaac looked away, his expression unreadable. We come here sometimes, Isaiah said, because she used to talk about this place, about Daniel. She said he was one of the few people who treated her like she mattered. Adrian felt something inside him twist painfully. He had never known any of this, never asked, never even thought to wonder what happened to the people who passed through his life like shadows, doing their jobs quietly, disappearing without notice. To him, they had been part of the system, replaceable, invisible. But standing here now, looking at these 2 boys, hearing their story, Adrian realized something that made his chest feel tight and heavy. Invisible to him did not mean invisible to the world. Invisible to him did not mean unimportant. The boys stood quietly, their eyes resting on the grave, their faces calm but filled with sadness that seemed far older than their years. Adrian looked down at the marble headstone, at his son's name carved in stone, and for the first time in a long time he felt ashamed. Not because he had lost his son. That pain would always be there. But because, in his grief, in his pride, in his relentless pursuit of power and control, he had failed to see the lives unfolding around him, lives that had been touched by his decisions, lives that had suffered in silence. And yet, there was still something he didn't understand. He looked back at the boys, his voice quieter now, almost hesitant. But why do you feel connected to him? Adrian asked. Why come here after everything? The twins exchanged a glance, and something in their eyes shifted. Something deeper, heavier, filled with meaning Adrian couldn't yet see. Isaiah reached slowly into his jacket, his fingers closing around something hidden inside. And in that moment, as Adrian watched him, a strange feeling settled in his chest again. A feeling that whatever came next would change everything. The wind rose suddenly, colder now, sweeping to the cemetery in a long, low whisper. Dry leaves scraped across the stone paths, and the trees swayed above, their branches creaking softly. Adrian Cole stood facing the two boys, the weight of their story still pressing on his chest, the silence between them thick and uneasy. Then the older twin moved. Slowly, carefully, he reached into the inside pocket of his worn jacket. His fingers lingered there for a moment, as if he were gathering courage, as if what he was about to reveal carried more weight than words alone could hold. When his hand emerged, he was holding a small envelope. It was plain, slightly creased. The edges were worn, as though it had been opened and closed many times over the years. This belonged to our mother, the boy said quietly. He stepped forward and held it out. Adrian hesitated before taking it, for reasons he couldn't explain. His hand felt heavier than usual, as if the simple act of reaching forward carried consequences he wasn't ready to face. But he took the envelope. It felt light, almost weightless, and yet, as Adrian slid his finger under the flap and opened it, a strange tension tightened in his chest. Inside was a single folded sheet of paper. Adrian unfolded it slowly. The moment his eyes fell on the handwriting, his breath caught. He knew that handwriting. Daniel's. A faint tremor passed through Adrian's hands as he began to read. The letter was short, the words uneven, written with the careful effort of someone who had been weak, someone who had been tired but determined to finish what they started. Daniel had written about long nights in the hospital, about fear, about the sound of machines beeping in the dark. But most of all, he had written about the nurse. He wrote about how she stayed when others left, how she spoke to him like he wasn't just a patient, like he was still a boy with dreams and thoughts and laughter inside him. He wrote about the stories she told, about the way she made him forget, even for a few minutes, that he was sick. Adrian felt his throat tighten as he read each line, and then he reached the sentence that made the world seem to stop. If anything ever happens to me, please make sure she and her children are taken care of. They're my family, too. Adrian's vision blurred. He lowered the letter slightly, staring at the paper as if the words might change if he looked long enough. But they didn't. They remained there, simple and clear, written in the careful hand of a boy who had understood something his father never had. Family. Adrian swallowed, but his throat felt dry, tight, as if the air itself had become heavier. He had never seen this letter before. No one had ever mentioned it. No one had placed it in his hands or spoken of his son's request. And suddenly, a painful thought struck him. Had Daniel been waiting for him to understand something, and he never had? We found it after our mother passed, Isaiah said softly. Adrian looked up. The boys were watching him quietly, their faces calm but filled with a quiet sadness that seemed far older than their years. She kept it in a box, Isaac added, with pictures and some of Daniel's drawings. Adrian felt something twist sharply in his chest. Pictures, drawings, memories of his son's last days that he himself had never seen, because he had been too busy with meetings, too busy with contracts, too busy building towers of steel and glass, while his son had been building connections of the heart with people Adrian barely noticed. The realization struck him like a slow, crushing wave. His son had not been alone in those final days, but Adrian had been absent, and the people who had filled that silence, the ones who had comforted Daniel, who had listened to him, who had cared for him as if he were their own, were the very people Adrian had never truly seen. To him, they had been staff, employees, names on schedules. But to Daniel, they had been family. Adrian looked back at the letter, his hands trembling slightly now, and read the words again. They are my family, too. The sentence echoed in his mind, over and over, like a quiet voice that refused to fade. A gust of wind passed through the cemetery, and Adrian became aware of how still everything else felt. The world seemed to have narrowed to this one moment, this one truth unfolding before him. He looked at the boys again, standing there in worn jackets, their eyes steady, their faces carrying both grief and strength. They were no longer strangers. They were the living proof of a part of Daniel's life Adrian had never understood. And suddenly, Adrian felt something he had not allowed himself to feel in years. Regret, not the sharp pain of loss, but the deeper, heavier regret of realizing that something important had been within reach, and he had never reached back. He cared about you, Adrian said quietly, his voice unsteady. Isaiah nodded. Our mother said he was the kindest boy she ever met. Isaac looked down at the grave, his expression softening. She said he used to ask about us. He wanted to meet us one day. Adrian closed his eyes briefly. His son had wanted to meet them, and Adrian had never known. The weight of that truth settled over him, like a stone pressing against his chest. For years, Adrian had believed he understood the world. He believed he knew what mattered: power, success, control. He believed kindness was a luxury, something secondary, something small compared to the grand achievements he chased every day. But standing here now, holding that letter, looking at the two boys who carried his son's memory in their hearts, Adrian realized how wrong he had been. Daniel, a boy who had faced death with quiet courage, had understood something Adrian had never learned, that the value of a life is not measured by wealth. It is measured by the love you leave behind. Adrian opened his eyes and looked at the twins again, really looked at them this time, not as strangers, not as children of a former employee, but as human beings connected to his son in a way that no amount of money could ever buy. And yet, even as that realization settled in his mind, another question began to form. If Daniel had seen them as family, what did that make Adrian now? The wind softened, the air growing still again, as if the world itself was waiting for the answer. And Adrian, standing there between the past and the present, felt something shifting inside him, something that was only just beginning to change. The cemetery did not feel as cold anymore. Weeks had passed since the morning Adrian Cole first saw the two boys crying at his son's grave. The winter air had softened. The trees were beginning to show the faintest hint of green, and the grass, once dull and gray, carried a quiet new life beneath the sunlight. Daniel's grave looked different now. Fresh flowers rested carefully against the marble, not just the expensive arrangements Adrian's assistant ordered each week, but small bouquets too, simple ones, tied by hand. Sometimes there were drawings left there, folded pieces of paper weighed down with small stones, so the wind wouldn't carry them away. And Adrian was no longer standing there alone. Isaiah and Isaac stood beside him, quiet but comfortable, as if this place no longer belonged only to memory and loss, but to something living and real. At first, their visits had been awkward. Adrian had not known what to say. The boys had been polite but cautious, still carrying the distance of children who had learned not to expect too much from the world. But time, in its quiet way, had begun to change things. Adrian had arranged for them to move into a small house not far from his own. Not a mansion, not something overwhelming, just a place filled with warmth, sunlight, and quiet peace. He made sure they were enrolled in a good school. He made sure they had everything they needed. But slowly, Adrian began to understand something important. None of that was what mattered most. What mattered most was sitting at the table with them in the evenings, listening to their stories about school, about friends, about the little victories and small worries that filled their days. What mattered was hearing their laughter, soft at first, then louder as they began to feel safe. What mattered was being present. One afternoon, Adrian found himself sitting on the floor of the living room, helping Isaac build a small model airplane, while Isaiah read quietly on the couch. The sunlight streamed to the window, warm and golden, and for a moment Adrian felt something he had not felt in years. Peace. Not the satisfaction of closing a deal or winning a negotiation, but the quiet, steady peace of simply being there. And sometimes, late at night, Adrian would sit alone and think about Daniel, about the boy who had seen the world more clearly at 12 years old than Adrian had seen it in 50. It humbled him. It changed him. One evening, as the sun was setting in long streaks of amber and gold, the three of them stood once again at the cemetery. The air was warm now, carrying the soft scent of earth and grass. The sky glowed gently above them, fading into shades of orange and violet. Adrian looked at the grave, then at the boys beside him. "Your mother," he said quietly, his voice thoughtful, almost hesitant. "She was a remarkable woman." Isaiah and Isaac listened in silence. "I should have seen that sooner," Adrian continued. "I should have understood how much she mattered, not just to Daniel, but to all of you." Isaiah nodded slowly. "She never expected people to notice," he said. "She used to say that doing good doesn't mean someone will thank you." Isaac looked down at the grave, then back at Adrian, but she also said something else. Adrian turned slightly. "What was that?" Isaac's voice was calm, but his words carried a quiet strength. She said people show who they really are, not when they're powerful, but when someone weaker needs them. The words settled into the silence around them. Adrian felt them sink deep into his chest, deeper than any speech or advice he had ever heard in a boardroom or conference hall. He realized in that moment how much of his life he had spent believing the wrong things. For years, he had believed success was measured in numbers, in profits, in the height of buildings and the size of accounts. He believed power meant control, that respect came from authority, that the world belonged to those who stood at the top. But standing there now, beside two boys who had lost everything and still found the strength to stand with dignity, Adrian understood the truth his son had already known. Greatness is not measured by how high a person rises. It is measured by how deeply they care for those who have no power at all. The wind moved gently through the trees, and Adrian looked at Daniel's name carved into marble. For the first time in years, the sight of it did not bring only pain. It brought something else. Pride, not in himself, but in his son. Daniel had left behind no fortune, no company, no empire, but he had left something far greater. He had left kindness in the hearts of others. He had left compassion that continued to live, to grow, to change lives even after he was gone. That was a legacy no money could ever buy. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the cemetery, Adrian felt a quiet certainty settle in his heart. He could not change the past. He could not go back and sit beside Daniel's hospital bed more often, could not undo the moments he had missed, the chances he had wasted. But he could choose what kind of man he would be now. He could choose to see people, to listen, to care. Isaiah stepped closer to the grave and gently placed a small drawing against the stone. It showed 3 figures standing together beneath a bright sun. Adrian didn't need to ask who they were. They stood there a little longer, saying nothing, letting the silence speak for them. And as the last light of day faded into the horizon, Adrian understood something that many people spend their whole lives chasing without ever finding. The richest legacy a person can leave behind is not wealth. It is kindness. Because money can build houses, but kindness builds homes. Money can buy comfort, but kindness gives belonging. And long after power fades and names are forgotten, the way you treated people, that is what remains. And in the quiet fading light, Adrian finally understood that the true measure of a life is not how much you take from the world, but how much love you leave behind.